We can start. So it's a pleasure, my pleasure. I'm Bill Johnson, by the way, one of the newer members of the Conservation Commission, which thankfully is well represented here this evening, as is our select board. Where would you go to, Bill? Oh. Oh, hi, Zeke. Excellent. So we're fortunate that even though we had to abort last week, a week ago, for good reason, we spared Shannon of having to drive all the way back to Rutland in those icy roads that developed last Thursday. Unfortunately, she was available this Thursday, and fortunately you folks are as well. Shannon has been with the Agency for National Resources for a little more than a decade.
About 10 years.
Mm-hmm. And as you see, she's the river scientist working out of Rutland and has responsibilities for southern Vermont. And we will learn more about all of that from her. Shannon?
Great, thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Yes, welcome to Dummerston.
Yeah, I don't think I've actually ever been to Dummerston, so this is all new to me. It's very exciting. I have the southern third of the state. So I've been most places, but I haven't made it quite here yet. So as I said, I am the river scientist with the Agency of Natural Resources, and I work for the Vermont Rivers Program. And the Vermont Rivers Program is responsible for regulating all in-stream channel work, as well as providing technical assistance for communities with their floodplain regulations and erosion hazard regulations, and any also technical assistance for restoration projects. And we do a lot of grant administration for water quality related grants. So we sort of encompass, lots of different aspects of river management in the state. So what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is reducing flood hazards. And as we've all seen from Tropical Storm Irene, a lot of communities in Vermont are very vulnerable to flood hazards. So where we can, we're going to, try to work with communities to prevent future flood hazards from occurring, minimize them where we can. So when we think of planning for flood hazards, most communities think of inundation hazards, which is when the water comes up and it spills onto the floodplain and basements get wet. And that's what most communities have regulations for through the National Flood Insurance Program. They have regulations for flooding hazards, which is on the left, which is where your feet get wet. What most communities don't consider is erosion hazards. And on the right, you can see that some streams during floods change catastrophically, or even sometimes during regular spring floods, there's a slow erosion process that occurs naturally in all systems. So the erosion on the right is something that most communities aren't planning for, and that's one thing that I'm here to try to help communities incorporate into their planning for flood hazards. So this is just another example. This is downtown Montpelier, which gets flooded by the Winooski River, and this is inundation hazards, and this is what most communities regulate. And this is just some more examples of erosion hazards where rivers catastrophically relocate or they erode onto adjacent houses and streams. So the National Flood Insurance Program, which most communities in Vermont participate in, the maps that are created through the National Flood Insurance Program only regulate the flooded areas. They don't consider channel movement, relocation, erosion, or catastrophic changes during floods. So the flood insurance program do not capture the worst case scenario or the maximum flood. Those maps that the towns use to regulate their floodplains usually only regulate to the 100-year flood event. And we know that there are floods larger than the 100-year flood event that could happen. They don't consider anything for dam breaches or culvert failures. They don't consider ice or debris jams, and they don't consider erosion. So there's a lot missing from what the communities are regulating right now as far as land use practices. And even communities that do use the maps for the flood hazard regulations that are produced by the National Flood Insurance Program, we did an analysis in 3 different counties in Vermont and found that 82% of streams don't have any maps through the National Flood Insurance Program, they tend to only map the larger streams. So as we know, there's also a lot of flooding that occurs on the smaller streams, the headwater streams and the smaller streams that don't have any maps. So, there's a lot of major gaps in just using the National Flood Insurance Program maps to regulate land use in your community. And what we found in Vermont is that most of our flood hazards, or most of our flood damage, occurs due to erosion. There is certainly a significant amount of flooding damage that occurs as well, but we find that a larger portion is from erosion or channel relocation. So, it's a pretty big gap in the way that we've been planning up until now. And what we know is that rivers adjust. There seems to be this expectation that, a river's always been in one location and that's where it should be, and, people keep putting it back. But we know that even natural channels will move over time if they're left to their own devices. That's just what they do. It's the natural physics of water and sand and geologic material is that the rivers are going to meander across the valley and back over time. And we've found that, there's usually a fairly predictable, what we call a corridor. The river might go one way this year and another way the next, but, we can predict with some certainty, what the area is that the river needs to meander within. And these are just a couple different examples. The bottom left is on the Lewis Creek, the Otter Creek, and, White River. So what we're trying to encourage communities to do is, in addition to, with this speckled area is the National Flood Insurance Program maps that they provide, is to also incorporate the corridor that we define that the river needs to meander within to be stable over time. So this is just a great example of, there's a lot of people who are, there's a lot of developments that have taken place where people have filled in the floodplain over time, and the National Flood Insurance Program requires towns to regulate their floodplains to a certain extent, but they do allow for filling in of the floodplain of the special flood hazard area. There's a certain area called the floodway that cannot be filled in, but generally speaking, if your town has adopted the minimum standards that FEMA requires, there is a significant amount of filling that can occur in the community. And what happens is that really, when somebody fills in, let's say, before development, the floodplain was a certain height, and somebody goes and fills in and does a significant amount of filling for a development, and all of a sudden that raises the water so that it's flooding other properties. So, you can imagine that that's a problem where people are just sort of thinking of their individual properties and their needs and interests in developing them without thinking of, planning for flood hazards at a community scale where, sometimes what we do is actually causing an impact onto somebody else's property. So why do we want to keep our streams healthy? Our streams provide all kinds of great functions and values that we value as a society. They provide flood mitigation. When the water goes out and floods in the floodplains, it actually lowers the water velocity and causes less damage. For water supply and groundwater recharge, for water quality reasons, our floodplains and our streams, when they're functioning properly, they will store a lot of sediment within the stream channel and within the floodplain. That's why we have such good soils in our floodplains, those prime agricultural soils, is because the silts are being deposited and not being washed downstream. I'm sure you've all heard of issues with Lake Champlain with phosphorus loading because, we have so much of our sediment not being stored in our watersheds and making its way into the larger water bodies and causing eutrophication. Habitat, we have recreation, transportation, aesthetics. We all value these resources as a society, and so it's worthy of protecting our streams and floodplains. So what we find is that our channels adjust in sort of a predictable way depending on how we manage them, depending on what we do in our watershed and what we do within the channels. The streams will react in a fairly predictable way depending on what we do. So this is called Lane's diagram, and it shows that primarily sediment and sediment size is on one side of the scale, and water and stream slope is on the other side. And so if we change these things, we can cause different adjustment processes in the channel. For example, degradation is when the stream cuts down into the bed, And aggradation is when the stream builds up, when the sediment builds up, when you see large bars. So you can imagine different scenarios where we're changing the stream slope. If we straighten a river and take a meander bend out, we could cause the river to go one way or the other. And so we're seeing a lot of this play out. We saw a lot of this play out during Irene, where how we were managing our channels, basically was reflected in what happened during the flood, whether the stream built up the channel bed or eroded down in the channel bed. So once channels start adjusting, once we start causing channels to get into this adjustment process, when we start changing the balance of water and sediment in our systems by either straightening them, dredging them, changing the water supply such that there's too much sediment in the streams, our streams go through a fairly predictable adjustment process. And what happens is, we start out with a stable channel up here, and somebody thinks, oh, this is a nice floodplain here. I'm going to put my house there right next to the river. Great view. Who wouldn't want to live next to a river? And then a flood comes and their house gets flooded. So they decide, well, I don't want my house to be flooded, so I'm going to dredge the river and I'm going to build this berm here to protect my house. And what happens is then, rather than the water being able to get out and flood in the floodplain, it's all concentrated in the channel. So there's a lot more erosive force and there's a lot more velocity because we have so much water in the channel that the river cuts down. So we've upset the balance of water and sediment, and the river cuts down. And what happens is it gets to a point where the banks become unstable and they start falling in. So we're basically, the house isn't flooding anymore, but we're trading a flood hazard for an erosion hazard, because instead of that house getting flooded, now we have this major erosion problem because we've destabilized the channel and the banks. So eventually, over time, through enough floods, the river will take the space that it needs back and recreate this floodplain at a lower elevation in the landscape. And we are seeing this play out in different phases all over Vermont. And what tends to happen is we get here, we get here and we put the river back to here, and then we have a flood and the river becomes really unstable, and we just keep going back to this state. So I'm just going to go through a couple of examples of what causes this imbalance in our systems. One is, this is an example that I made for another community, but there's been a lot of berms built in Vermont to keep areas from, to make areas developable and to keep them from flooding. And so what happens is, a river that may have had a whole valley to flood within now is cut off and contained, the water is contained within a channel on one side of a berm. So you can imagine that changes how the stream is going to function. We have channel straightening. This is pervasive in Vermont. Some watersheds, there's a significant amount of channel straightening that has occurred. And what happens is when we developed our landscapes, we needed to make room for our transportation infrastructure, our development, our villages, agricultural operations. And so we tended to just sort of put the rivers wherever we wanted them. If they weren't in a convenient spot, we just relocated them and moved them. And a lot of streams are still adjusting to that process. You can see this is Route 89, where if you ever drive up Route 89 to Burlington, you can see whole meanders on the opposite side of the highway that were cut off when that highway was put in place. So this is just another example of floodplains. They help to dissipate water. They reduce the flashiness of the floods. The rivers in Vermont that have the most floodplain access had the least erosion on them because they came up, they flooded, and they went back down. So they didn't have this catastrophic relocation because they didn't have that energy. They didn't have the energy because the water spreads out, it slows down, and it goes back in its channel. And a lot of our rivers are still adjusting to land clearing that occurred when Vermont was settled, back in the 1800s, when there was a lot of sheep grazing on the mountainsides. A lot of sediment was transported into our valley bottoms, and there is still some significant adjusting going on to that landscape modification. And we also know that our exposure to floods is increasing with time rather than decreasing. We have greater land development, which creates impervious surfaces, which gets the water to the river faster. We have our channels are enlarging because of all of that changes in stormwater rather than the water, dropping on a tree and falling on the ground and going into the groundwater supply, a lot of our water is changed and is being channeled right into our rivers. So our rivers are enlarging to accommodate that increase in water. And then we also have the potential of global climate change, which is sort of a wild card at this point. We're not sure what's going to happen. You know, I'm no expert, but I have to say between Irene and this winter, you know, it's a little frightening to think of the possibilities of what might be happening to our climate. And this is a figure from a report that showed that the amount of heavy rain precipitation is increasing. Not necessarily that rain overall is increasing, but the amount of heavy rain, the amount of really high-intensity rainfall is increasing in the Northeast. So the other thing is a lot of people talk about the frequency of flood, the 100-year flood, the 500-year flood, and it's also really important to think about the intensity and the duration are really important factors. Those really change the flood because depending on how much rain you get, if it rains for a really long time, you might have a more intense storm, even though it might be a 100-year event. And what's interesting about that is that if you think about it, the water can come up to a 100-year floodplain and fill in that floodplain and go right back down. And you can imagine that would do a certain amount of damage. But if that water stays at that level for a significant amount of time, like it did during Irene, it stayed there for, you know, sometimes 12 to 18 hours, you can imagine that it's eroding, 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 eroding. And so it's not necessarily just the frequency of the event, but it's also the duration of the event. The longer the flood lasts, the longer the water is high, the more damage it does. And this whole idea of recurrence interval comes up all the time. I keep hearing people say it was a 100-year event, you know, we don't need to worry about it, it won't happen again. And talking to Barry Cahoon, who he was the stream alteration engineer covering this region after Irene. Some of you may have met with him. He has been with the Rivers program for forever, 35 years, I think. He came up with these numbers that major flood events have occurred, if you count since 73, every 12 years, and if you count since 27, they've occurred every 14 years in southern Vermont. So the idea of, you know, we don't need to worry about it, you know, we really do need to worry about it because these major floods are occurring every 12 to 14 years in southern Vermont. So, you know, it's a real concern. And this is just a map showing the different floods that have occurred over time and where they've occurred. And interestingly, before Irene, I've always had the southern region, and you can see that, you know, it's much clearer than the other areas. So I would always say, oh, look, you know, we're so lucky in southern Vermont. We haven't had a flood in a long time, but, you know, I guess we were due because we hadn't had one, you know, major flood since really the 70s. There's been a lot more smaller, high-intensity floods up north, but we hadn't had as many down here. So now we have, unfortunately. So also, over the course of a 30-year mortgage, if you're in the special flood hazard area with the National Flood Insurance Program, your property has a 26% chance of being exposed to flooding compared to a 9% chance of being exposed to fire. So you can imagine that, you know, people are saying we don't need to worry about it, it's a 100-year floodplain, but, you know, once you think about it in these parameters, we realize we really do need to be thinking about it and planning for how we're going to develop these areas. So these are just a couple of examples of the consequences of treating our streams as if they're static and allowing development to occur, you know, adjacent to our streams in areas that are prone to erosion. We wind up needing to continuously dredge and channelize and berm our rivers, and we end up with properties in, you know, really precarious situations, you know, when they're perched on top of slopes that are unstable. And just more examples of private property damage done to public infrastructure that we all pay for. We all pay for that to be rebuilt as, you know, taxpayers of this state and country. So the traditional approach has always been to go in, put the river back exactly where it was, put the berms back, dredge, berm, armor. There's just some more pictures of East Middlebury during an earlier flood. These are some examples from Brattleboro, and actually the top one is Ball Mountain Brook, I believe. These two are the whetstone in Brattleboro. And once people have encroached on that river, once people have been there, it requires constant channel management. We have to rock the bank at great expense. We have to dredge the river and constantly fight that battle. And you have to think about what are the real costs. I mean, the real cost, there's a cost to public safety, you know, because we're putting people in hazardous areas when we allow people to develop in our communities in areas that we, know are prone to erosion. And then there's the loss of property, and the least of which is money, but still a big concern for many, many people. So we get stuck in this cycle where we have flood and property damage. We dredge the rivers, we berm them, and we armor the banks. And then we don't have a flood for a while, and people start feeling comfortable. I hear it so many times from people my age, the river's always been there. The river's always been there. But if we think in geologic terms, the river created the whole valley. I mean, that's why our valleys are flat, is because the river moved, across and deposited sediment. So, to think that a river has always been in one location is just not realistic. Our rivers move, they're dynamic. That's the physics of water and sediment. So people build houses and encroach, and people have this amazing property rights debate, property rights feeling that, this is my property and I have the right to fully develop it. And so they encroach and they build houses and put infrastructure and investments in areas that have been flooded before. And then, we get another flood and we get sort of stuck in this very costly cycle. So, there's this whole debate about dredging right now and whether dredging provides any long-term flood proofing. And there are places where dredging not only needs to happen but is appropriate, where channels completely filled in and rivers were going through houses or villages. There was some real legitimate reasons why we needed to remove some material from some of these channels. But the reality is that if we just do wholesale dredging of our rivers, we're just basically passing the buck downstream. We're just saying, we don't want to deal with our flooding, you deal with it. And then, the next community, no, you deal with it. And all it's doing is just, putting more water downstream. So there's some serious consequences to gravel extraction too if it's not done right, and if it's not done by an engineer and planned for. It can create head cuts, and what a head cut is that if you dredge a channel to a certain point and you leave a steep area, that steep area can actually migrate upstream and lower the bed upstream of there. It just creates it basically destabilizes the bed of the channel upstream of the dredged location. And it also creates a sediment discontinuity. What's going to happen in a dredged area is that all the sediment that comes down is going to fill in that area because it's going to be sort of like a hole in the system. And so there's going to be no sediment going downstream. And that might sound strange to be an issue, but actually our rivers move water and sediment, and it's sort of the process creates a balance in the system, moving the water and the sediment, and the sediment helps to slow the water down. And so if we have an area that's sort of hogging all the sediment because it was dredged and the sediment isn't making it downstream, that can actually cause erosion downstream. So we can have instability both upstream and downstream. So there are real consequences, and we need to plan for areas where we're going to dredge.
Excuse me, what was that YouTube link?
Oh yeah, I tried to get on Wi-Fi here. I couldn't do it. There's a YouTube link that shows this really well, shows the gravel mining. And I can send that I can give anybody that, that address if you want to go look at it. I couldn't get it to work on my computer here, but I was going to show it so that you could see it. And basically, it's sort of like a big sandbox. It's called the river flume that you can put water through. And it shows this really well. They send dye through, and it shows, like, if you take the gravel out, how it just fills back in and causes a lot of instability. So this is a hypothetical example that one of my colleagues came up with, and it basically, a lot of people are thinking that dredging our channels, somehow increases the community's flood resiliency because we're creating more capacity in the channel. And what she showed was basically that if we assume a flood depth of 3 feet and a channel of 80 feet wide, and we take out 20 to 30 dump trucks in a 100-foot section of stream, that's a lot of material to be removed, that would lower the flood depth by 0.8 inches at great expense. I'm not sure how much that would cost. I know a community up north, dredged a couple of 100 feet of stream, and it cost over $100,000. So we're talking about a significant cost to lower the flood depth 0.8 feet, or 0.8 inches, I'm sorry. And in order for all of the flood to be contained within the channel would need to be 48 feet deep. So the reality is that in most of our channels, dredging is not creating very much capacity. And the other thing to consider is that the material that's moved during a flood is going to fill it right back in. So we could dredge our channels, and when we get another flood, it's going to fill right back in. And so how much flood capacity is it actually creating when it's filling in, as the flood is occurring? So I thought that was an interesting calculation. So what we try to do is with the Rivers Program and lots of our partners, we work with the regional planning commissions and the conservation districts and conservation commissions. We try to break this cycle of constantly dredging and armoring and encroaching and having all of these conflicts through what we call river corridor protection, which is basically a process by which we go through an assessment program, and then we identify the area that's prone to erosion, and then we also, in the process, identify restoration projects that we can do within each watershed to try to restore the function back to its natural state as much as we can. And we work with communities to try to implement these restoration projects and also adopt these corridors and try to keep people from developing in these areas prone to erosion hazard. So this is an example. This is actually the Whetstone and Ames Brook in Brattleboro. And it just sort of shows what a river corridor looks like, the area that we would sort of identify as needing some level of protection. And so this is just another map showing that you can overlay the erosion hazard area with the floodplain area and regulate both at the community level. So you would be regulating for both the inundation hazard and the erosion hazard. And these are just some more examples of what happens if we don't protect our corridors. We basically wind up with these, houses in really bad locations, needing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of channel work to be maintained in that location. And then also where we don't have assessments, we have a process by which we can create a corridor for a stream without having an assessment. Because for a lot of the smaller streams, like in Dummerston, for example, there's some smaller streams that we don't have data on, but we do have a process to sort of delineate that corridor without having the full assessment done. So this is just an example. This is our assessment program. We have a phase 1, which is done at a whole watershed scale, and then we go out and do phase 2, which is a field-based assessment where we walk every mile of stream and take all kinds of pictures and measurements to see how the stream is functioning. And then we go into the corridor planning, which is a report that sort of takes all the data and analyzes it and reduces it into real projects on the ground that can be implemented to help reduce the conflicts that are occurring in the watershed. So this is just an example of how the erosion hazard area is defined. It's not a strict setback from the channel, like a lot of communities will have, let's say, a 50-foot or 100-foot setback, which is a good start. But what that does is it would create, something like this, where people are still developing in areas, that where the river would cut off. That's sort of the natural process. As the river gets to a point in the meander where it becomes too much work for the river to make it all the way around, and it cuts off. So, if you just have the standard setback, there's still areas that are very vulnerable that could be developed. So what we do is we draw what we call the meander center line down the middle, and then we delineate a corridor. So it's very different from a standard setback. Oh, I don't like these. These are high tech. This was one of my coworkers. So what can we do to avoid damages due to flooding? There's sort of different levels. Like on a family basis, if you're in a floodplain or in an area prone to erosion, you can be prepared, create a family plan, practice it, know what you're going to do if there's a flood. During Irene, we were very fortunate that the flood occurred during the day. We were very fortunate. If that water had come up during the night, who knows what would have happened, but I'm scared to think of what would have happened if, we hadn't had, daylight during the flood. We can also adopt regulations to avoid known hazards. You know, at the community level, you can adopt in your town plan, in your zoning bylaws, in your pre-disaster mitigation plan, you can reference this information and adopt these zones and regulate them in a way that's consistent with channel movement over time. So we also have, the legislature adopted Act 110 last year, which is a bill basically that outlines that river corridor protection is an important part of Vermont. We need to start pursuing it. And it also outlined incentives to communities that adopt erosion hazard zones and stricter floodplain regulations. And so basically, communities could potentially get a, increase in, or a higher rating for certain water quality related grants if they are proactive in protecting their floodplain assets. So all of the water quality related, I don't know if Dummerston has ever received like watershed grant or ecosystem restoration grant, or any of these grants would be, communities that take these steps to be proactive would get bumped to the top of the list for those grant funds. And these are just a couple of examples of the different plans that communities can work with. We have basically emergency operation plans, multi-jurisdiction all hazard mitigation plans. Those are done at the regional planning commission, and then every town, or most towns in Vermont, also have a town plan, which can all be informed by erosion hazards. And this is just a little bit of comedy. This was in Pittsfield. I just couldn't help but take a picture. This one is for you, Irene, huh? Yeah. It's the neatest scarecrow I've ever seen, or whatever it is. So anyway, this has my contact information, as well as the stream alteration engineer, who is Todd Manise for this region. So you can contact either myself or him if you need any assistance. And I'd be happy to answer questions if anybody has them. Ooh. Yeah.
What about, you didn't mention too much about the dams that man does, the big dams, and then there's all kinds of little dams on smaller streams. There's culverts, there's all kinds of man-made things. What about them in concerning the rivers and the brooks and streams?
Well, there was actually a great, did you happen to hear the noontime VPR discussion yesterday? They had a special on dams.
Part of it.
It was really interesting. I'm sure they have a link on their webpage if you want to listen to it. Dams we have flood control dams in Vermont that provide some flood storage, and in places they've provided reduced flooding. But the issue is that they have an impact on the environment, on the ecology of the system, because they basically provide a barrier to anything that migrates upstream, can't get upstream of a dam. So, there's a habitat degradation that occurs from dams. There's also a sediment issue, like the sediment isn't making it past the dam, the sediment stops at the dam. So that can create instability downstream. So it's sort of a cost-benefit thing that everybody needs to go through on individual structures. It's not, they're not all bad, they're not all good. It's just sort of like some are there and are providing a good service.
Well,
Others should be removed if they're not providing a good service to the community.
if people have their own dams, and there are a few around on little streams, are they supposed to open them up and let them run at certain times of the year, or are they allowed to keep them closed all the time?
It depends on the dam. It depends on the size. And I think people are generally allowed to do what they want to do unless they're regulated under the law. And I'm not exactly 100% sure which dams are regulated and which ones aren't. But generally speaking, people just do, if they're privately owned and they're private structures, and a lot of times they deteriorate, and then they're a hazard, because nobody's maintaining them, and they deteriorate, and then, nobody wants to pay the hundreds of thousands of dollars per dam to maintain them properly. So they do, in places they can create a real significant hazard.
I had heard, and that's why I'm asking you, that flashboards had to come out like in October and couldn't go back in until, so that's not true.
That may be true. I don't know. I'd have to ask the dam safety people about that. I don't know enough specifics about the dam regulations, but I could look into it and get back to you.
And culverts, no big deal with narrowing.
Oh, well.
waterways?
It's a significant problem. I didn't talk about it, but yeah, it's a significant problem. What happens is they basically act like dams. Like what she's talking about is culverts and bridges that are too small. They basically act like dams, because what happens is if they're not passing the water, they can either get plugged with debris, which happens a lot, or they just back up. And then oftentimes they'll fail catastrophically. You know, the water will build to a point where it takes out the culvert or the bridge that's too small, and, you know, a big gush of water goes downstream. And that happened in quite a few places during this last flood. I heard of a lot of people saying that the flood came in pulses, that, you know, there would be like a big pulse of water. And we're speculating that some of that was these culverts failing up in the watershed and sending down big pulses of water. They are regulated, so as they come up for replacement and get a permit, they do need to be a certain size. But we have a whole slew of these undersized culverts that are in our systems right now that are causing problems. But those are definitely regulated through the stream alteration program.
The one major problem we had during Irene in Dummerston happened just a mile up the road on Route 30, where one of the bridge abutments was washed away.
Really? Oh, yeah.
The Rock River, of course, it brought pretty much the whole village of South Newfane downstream with it.
I saw South Newfane. That was pretty remarkable.
As you spoke about sediment, I assumed it was sand and gravel, mud, and such.
Right.
My particular situation is the sediment can be as much as a 1,000-pound boulder, and these have all shifted and jeopardized my property.
Mm-hmm.
So I was sorry that in your talk you didn't address more of our rock streams that may be on bedrock and not cutting into, you know, channels or dredgeable and things such as that.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure which stream you're talking about in particular, but some of our streams are on bedrock because they've cut down to bedrock.
Right. Okay.
They might be on bedrock now, but in a natural setting, they probably, you know, they may not be there. And that may, what is it?
Unless it's mountainside.
Right.
Presumably always was.
Right. Yeah, some of the headwater streams. But I don't know. I'd have to come out and look at it specifically. You know, there certainly was a lot of large material moved. And I'm sure it could be causing problems. I'm not sure what, you know, the specific situation is in your
I'm down
case.
in Broadbrook, in Guilford. Batten, where I'm at the lower end, before it enters the Connecticut, it is a river at that point.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
And the Wyndham Regional Commission has a rainfall map for Irene. And when the commission gave a presentation a month ago, it starts out by saying that actually Irene was not very much rain. It was 4 inches in Wyndham County. My question is, when you're looking at catastrophic, you know, rainfall, where does 4 inches fit? Is 6 inches a possibility? Are 7-inch rains a possibility? You know, I mean, when we start, I mean, we hear about hurricanes all over the United States where they've got 8, 9, 10 inches of rain. Has that ever happened up here in any of those other, in 38 or whatever?
Well,
because we didn't have much damage happen in our community.
Right.
But we didn't have, you know, categorically looking at, you know, the Northeast, 4 inches of rain is not a lot of rain.
Right. You know, there are so many different factors that go into flooding. It's not just a simple, you know, this amount of rain causes this much damage because, well, for one thing, we did get more than that in Rutland County where I live. We got more like 8 to 12
I understand,
inches.
but we only had
Right,
4.
right. You know, it depends on if the ground is saturated. If the ground is saturated, it depends on the duration, how long it takes to get that 4 inches. You know, 4 inches of rain in an hour might be worse than 10 inches of rain in 24 hours. You know, so it's all so...
Well,
but I don't have an
my point
exact
is, I
number.
think we consider ourselves lucky because our damage was very little. You know, most of the damage for the roads was, you know, a few weeks before that when we had, you know, duration, a lot more, we had more washouts. Not in Irene. But I think that, you know, if we're looking at climate change, I don't know what the projections are, but I figure that what we had was really small. I mean, we have to
Right.
be prepared for
A lot
twice
worse.
as much water
Right.
coming through the community, and twice as much water coming. I mean, we've got houses already, you know, we can all envision which houses get washed out, and which stream banks go, because these little brooks become monsters.
Right.
So,
I agree with you. I don't have an exact number of, you know, what would cause a catastrophic flood in Windham County, but I agree with you that we need to be considering worst case scenario, which is probably worse than what we've seen.
a lot more water than we had.
Right.
Well, really,
Scary.
you're talking about eastern Windham County that's fair, because western Windham County, Wardsboro, Jamaica,
Okay.
Wilmington.
But when the Wyndham Regional Commission puts this map up for the whole county, there are only very few places that have more than 4 inches of rain. I mean, that's it. 4 inches did that much damage.
Short period of time.
We had,
And
in 2005, I experienced another flood. It was actually higher water than Irene gave me. It was in Guilford Center itself received 8 inches of rain within a 24-hour period, and it was devastating for me. I lost, 7 years of stone work.
My neighbor's rain gauge was 12 inches. In Williamsville? Where was that? Eastover. Eastover.
Yes.
I'm sure you must have recommendations for what towns can do on riverbanks and stream banks as far as trees and shrubs and things to keep the
Yeah.
brook in place.
Yeah, I mean, trees and shrubs can help, but, we need to expect that rivers are going to move. So, I think the best advice I can give is to, vegetate, a significant amount of the bank, but, sort of don't expect the rivers to stay static and give them some room. And the more room we can give rivers in our watershed, the less they'll erode our villages, for example. Like, if we can conserve land or protect land and let the rivers move and flood upstream of our villages, that will take some of the pressure off. But right now, there's not a whole lot of cause and effect going on at the local level in planning. So, we're just trying to encourage people to think about that. Like, if we want to reduce future flood risks, the water needs to go somewhere. So we need to figure out, where can we, have zoning and town plans consider, what areas are we going to let flood? What areas are we going to try to protect? Because we can't just keep, making things worse every year. Yes?
I'm Michelle, and I'm over on Miller Road. There's no chance at all that we'll get flooded if we do. God forbid, there won't be any town left. It sounds like, and perhaps you can add to the subject, the state wants to have towns or, perhaps regions really address this themselves without them stepping in with the heavy sledgehammer saying, we don't need to do this anymore. We need to really take responsibility just for letting it have this corridor. Now, are you here because of our invitation or because, the state said we need to send you on a road trip?
Our invitation.
I'm here, yeah. I was invited.
How many other invitations?
But it is a
are
part
you
of my
getting?
job. I mean, it is a big part of my job to help communities, with this planning effort. So I might have come at some point anyway.
Is it now speeded up?
We don't have any more staff, so, we only have the capacity to do, as much as we can do. But yeah, I mean,
Okay.
it's certainly, it's our number one priority is, to help communities in this effort. So other.
So, without more staff, in order to prepare one of those corridor studies, then it would seem like people would just be lining up for quite some long time to come.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're trying to work on other strategies. We've put in some money to FEMA. We've requested some money from FEMA to hire contractors to do. We generally hire contractors because I have a third of the state, so we generally hire contractors to do the assessment, and I QA it and sort of help train them and things. But I don't tend to actually do that myself. So it's just a matter of finding the money to hire the people to do the work, and so we're working on that. But yeah, I mean, this is our program priority, is to create these corridors and get them to the communities as quickly as we can. So if any towns are interested, we would make it a priority.
Do you have some success stories because of Irene? I mean, the media were flooded with stories of towns that were just devastated.
Yeah.
Do you know of any examples of towns that might have escaped that kind of devastation because of planning?
Yeah, I think the one town that comes to mind that we've worked with is Ripton, Vermont, where they had 200-year floods in 2008, I believe it was, and their village just, flooded twice. They had the Middlebury River flowing down their main street and flooding houses and also eroding quite a bit. And we worked with them. They adopted the erosion hazard zone into their zoning, and so we worked really hard to get them funding to do some stream bank work where they protected one bank side, but in addition they opened up a flood chute to help provide more storage for the river during flood stage, and it was engineered really well so that it was only to be used at certain flood stages. We hired a fantastic engineering company and project manager, and it functioned great. They escaped with very little damage there, where if we hadn't done that work, it probably would have been, just like it was in 2008 with houses flooding, and the river would have probably relocated again. And, it's hard to say what would have exactly happened if we hadn't done that work and worked with the community. We also, in Ripton, conserved a bunch of floodplain land upstream of the village so that it could never be developed and it could never be bermed or dredged, or, it has to be left open for the river to flood. So those are the types of things we're trying to do with communities, is figure out what options are available to each community to improve your flooding resiliency. Also, Bennington had a big project done a couple of years ago that we worked with and helped fund, which was a berm relocation project where they adopted this zoning to be proactive in keeping people out of these areas. And we worked with them to relocate a berm back on town-owned property, and it opened up, I'm not sure how many acres, but it opened up a couple of acres of land, and it prevented a lot of damage to their town bridges and infrastructure. So, there are definitely some good examples out there where we've had good success.
I'm just curious, what kind of, if any, problems do you experience with landowners rather than public property, where you attempt to create a floodplain out of what maybe was somebody's agricultural land? Right.
Well, it's all voluntary. We don't go in and tell anybody they have to do anything, but we've developed programs to try to compensate landowners for putting their land in conservation. We have what we call a river corridor easement program, and we work with either the Vermont Land Trust or the Vermont River Conservancy, and we put permanent conservation easements on properties to allow rivers to move and flood and function, and try to compensate those landowners for either lost productivity or actual lost land.
In perpetuity?
Forever. So, yeah, we have that program where through our assessment and corridor planning, we identify key parcels, within a watershed. Like, okay, these are the top 10 places in this watershed that, would provide the best bang for our buck. And we work with those landowners to try to compensate them for putting permanent easements on their property. We've done that in quite a few locations throughout the state. That program started just about 3 or 4 years ago, and we were on a steep learning curve, but we've done quite a few of them now, and actually many of them during Irene functioned beautifully and really provided some good flood attenuation in the watersheds. The provisions in those easements, it's not necessarily, if you have a big ag field, it's not necessarily taking the ag field out of production. What it does is it sets aside room for the river to move, and it requires a 50-foot buffer on the stream, but the landowner can continue to use the land that's in the corridor as long as the river isn't relocating there. So it's sort of, they can still have some productivity on the land until the river moves, and then they have to, maintain this 50-foot buffer. So, trying to accommodate existing land uses, but also, in the long term, set aside the land that the river needs. Yes, I don't know. Who's next?
Oh, go ahead.
I know regional planning commissions did a lot to assist communities in dealing with the effects of Irene.
Yes.
Are they up to speed now in terms of working with communities to upgrade flood hazard, erosion mitigation, and so forth, regulations? you know, if Dummerston, for example, were to ship its current zoning flood hazard bylaw down to the Wyndham Regional Commission,
Yeah.
now, are they staffed capably enough to assess this and make some good advice on
Yeah.
changes that should be made in light
Absolutely.
of what you were talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. We've worked with all of the RPCs in southern Vermont over the years. They've been great partners in the assessments and the corridor planning, and you know they've been there right along with us on this learning curve and working with communities, and absolutely they would be up to speed on this. We would partner with them because I would actually create the zone, and if they were available, they could draft the zoning for the community. We've developed a lot of different models for communities. So we have sort of boilerplate templates that communities can work with. So yeah.
This could take into account the smaller streams that aren't covered in
Yeah.
current.
So I would create that
Bylaw.
corridor for them
Right.
on the smaller streams
Right.
that don't have any data. I would create that, and we would work with the regional commission and the town to work towards getting something adopted if the town was interested. Yes.
Given the expectation that of climate change and that these storms, these 100-year floods can become more frequent as time goes on, and your point earlier about incentivizing farmers or landowners to provide floodplain areas, is there anything in the thought process about providing incentives for people who have homes or buildings that are damaged during floods not to rebuild there but provide them with the means to relocate and build someplace else?
Right. It's a great question. There is a program through FEMA called the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and that
They give 75%.
they give 75%. I've heard rumors that there may be some programs available or coming available, or there may be some push to get state funds to cover some of the match, or I'm not sure that that's going to happen, but
I keep thinking of places like, I wasn't necessarily thinking of Vermont alone, but I keep thinking of places like the Outer Banks where,
Right.
they get hurricanes all the time, and then
They put it right
the
back.
houses get washed out, and then 2 years later, the houses are back there.
Right.
And you sit there and you scratch your head and you
I know. Well, it doesn't make sense from a taxpayer standpoint because we're actually paying to rebuild those houses,
Right.
and it's
So I was wondering
frustrating.
if there was something,
Yeah.
that you were aware of that.
I mean, I think there's a hazard mitigation grant program, and there's also provisions in the FEMA regulations that if things are substantially damaged, and I'm not an expert, I would, if you're really interested, I could get somebody, but there's certain provisions where if a house is substantially damaged to the point where it's more than 50% damage, that in certain cases they have to put it back together in a way that makes it more flood resilient. So, I know that there's certain provisions in the regulations and that there's some FEMA funding available for buyouts, but, so many of our villages are just, they're there and they're not going anywhere, and we have to figure out a way to work around it and try to, work in other areas of the watershed to take the pressure off. Because there's going to be certain areas that are going to have to be managed over time. They're going to have to be dredged and armored, and, there's too much investment to allow the river to, express its, full meander form. But we still have a lot of opportunity in Vermont, to let our rivers have a little bit more room and dissipate the energy.
Well, the Whetstone Brook is one of those, like in West Brattleboro.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that.
I'm sure you are.
We did an assessment and a quarter plan there a couple of years ago. So, yep. Yes.
I think talking to people along the Mad River in northern Vermont,
Yep.
seems to me that one of the conclusions they came to was that we really need to work on the small streams and the headwaters. That it's almost in vain to work on the main stem if you're leaving all these unfortunate conditions in place up above, because then the water just comes down or the sediment comes down and you wipe out what you're doing in the big valley.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound right to you or not?
I think it depends on the watershed. If there's a lot of modifications in the headwaters, then yeah. Or if there's, if there's a lot of dysfunction, I guess you could call it, in the headwaters, then that could be true. But I think no matter what, conserving the lowland floodplain is important, because most of our headwater streams don't have a whole lot of flood capacity. They're sort of steep and bouldery, and they tend to just move water from one place to the next. They don't store it very well because they just don't have the room in the valley. So I think if we're looking at, looking for flood resiliency, we're looking for, increased capacity for our floodplains, that we probably are going to focus more on the main stems. But I think from a sediment standpoint, a lot of the sediment is coming from the headwaters. So looking at things like, improving our road drainage and, things like that are certainly from that standpoint, yeah, we're better off focusing on the headwaters than on the main stems. So I don't think it's like all or nothing. I think, we need to focus on different things in different areas in our watersheds.
Well, I have one more question to this, maybe to the entire room. I lived for 20 years just over the hill over Dummerston, Line, and Putney, so I'm very familiar with this area. How much did change, say, in West River up into Townsend, where there was large level land and the river does do a huge meander, something like River Bend area? How much, does anybody know how much changed there and how that's going to affect you down here?
It didn't change that much.
It did not.
Through Townsend, the West River, through Townsend and Newfane didn't change course, I don't believe. I'm not aware of any changes.
Okay. And trees held the banks in place, and
I think that there may have been in that River Bend area, that may have overran the banks a little bit in the low areas, but
things held up.
but yeah, it was mainly the Rock River, that went nuts.
And then what, Townsend Dam retained? Did it
Now, I don't know about the dams, I don't know what the story was at the dams.
A
I
lot
assume
must
they were
have
full,
filled in
but
behind in there.
And that was the question I was going to ask, if anybody had any information about the Townsend and Jamaica dams. Fall Mountain, yes, how much they retained of that water that we might have got. I do know anecdotally that, and some of you people might have been involved in standing by the covered bridge up here, waiting to see if the West River was going to come up far enough to take it out. It only missed by a few inches, I believe. Anybody have any specific information on that?
Yeah, it was quite a lot more than a few inches.
Okay.
There were a bunch of trees that jammed against the center pier, and that was causing water to surge, but it was, I'd say, 5 feet maybe from the bottom of the bridge itself.
That doesn't seem like very much, actually.
No, it doesn't.
I was in the emergency management office, and it was within 4 feet of the decking when they closed it.
Yeah.
And it was because of the debris
Right.
in the river that they closed it.
Which is my particular problem down on Broadbrook, that entire trees can get ripped out of state forest and cause log jams, or just the river, the water to divert, right, for moments, which can be devastating. Yeah.
So where you would work with the town in doing these corridors, is that typically the town tries to get some grant money to fund this?
We could do it that way, or I guess I'd have to figure out. I'm not that familiar with Dummerston. This is my first time here, so I guess I'd have to look into the rivers that are here. I mean, I looked a little bit on the map, but I'd look into them and see, whether we'd want to do a full assessment, or whether we think just having, a corridor delineated another way would be sufficient. And, I'd work with the other local partners to figure that out, and, we would go on from there. But if we did want to do a full assessment, then yes, we'd want to get some grant funds. And there's a program called the Ecosystem Restoration Program that it's a state-funded program. So we're out of money, I think, for this year. But assuming the legislature approves it again, we could have money again next summer, to apply for funding. And I could help the town, write the grant and submit that and figure out budgets and how much it would cost, and help them, if it gets funded, hire a contractor. Or oftentimes the conservation district will serve that role, will sort of serve as the project manager for communities. They would write the grant and administer it and hire a contractor and do everything, for communities. So it depends, but somehow I would work with the regional partners to make it happen if the community was interested.
I don't know, this town it's not a prime candidate, I don't think. We're not like, say, the town of Ripton, where we have a village right on a river.
Right.
We tend to have settlements at high ground,
Right.
Or near smaller, Salmon Brook, for example, just smaller streams. But there are still small issues on small streams.
Right.
I mean, my father has property where there's a culvert under the driveway, and the driveway's been washed out twice in the past 30 years. And, probably the culvert's been too small, but also there are culverts upstream, and the town road washed out, and all this gravel came down. So, there are upstream issues too, so that becomes more, it's just not a single landowner's problem anymore.
Right.
And I'm not quite sure how the town can address this, but it's small potatoes compared to the damage of Hurricane Irene,
Right.
you know.
Right.
So it's,
But, I think even on small streams, there can still be significant erosion hazards, I don't know the streams here in particular. I'd be happy to take a look at them and let the town know what I think, but it depends on the storm and the flood, but oftentimes, like when I showed that map of the different storms that had happened in Vermont, oftentimes they're really flash floods. We get like Ripton, for example, in 2008. It was these really flash floods that were in the headwaters that caused a lot of damage on the smaller streams. So, Irene might have happened to have caused a lot more damage on the bigger streams because of the duration of the storm. But, there could be flashier storms that cause a lot of damage on smaller streams. So keeping infrastructure away from, houses and development away from the smaller streams could be equally as important, during a different type of event. So.
Perhaps we need to stop using the terminology 100, 200 years if these things
Absolutely.
are happening, every decade or so, or more frequently. One
Right.
hurricane on top of another. There could have been a hurricane right behind it.
It's a great point. And the issue is that we don't have our gauges on the rivers that data is based on. The record isn't long enough to know what a real data set would look like. We only have maybe 100 years of data. So to say that something's a 100-year event when we only have 50 years of data, every time we get a big flood, it's like, oh, that was really the 100-year flood, and the one we thought was the 100-year flood is now the 50-year flood, or the 25-year flood, or the 10-year flood. So, yeah, I agree with you. We need to just stop using it. And actually, my program, I shouldn't even use the term 100-year flood. They try to call it the 1% annual chance of flood, because that's sort of what it is. It means every year there's a 1% chance of having that flood, which is sort of a better representation. It doesn't mean, every year you have the same. It could happen every year. It's just every year there's a 1% chance of that flood occurring. It doesn't occur every 100 years. It's not like, clockwork, like, oh, it's been 100 years, here comes the flood. We could have them every 10 years. It's just a return frequency that's based on a small data set that really doesn't reflect,
As a scientist, does your observations and data take in groundwater levels and what then would be increasing headwater streams? That just our groundwater in general has all of a sudden come up, or risen quite a bit. I know for many years it was talked that groundwater levels, water table was lowering due to the amount of wells being drilled, quite a few.
Yeah.
Now that seems to have reversed. I did like what you said in terms of the impervious, like blacktop allowing, or just paved, not necessarily paved, but even dirt roads allowing more water to run in. But I have huge springs around it. Hillsides 300 feet above river level. They don't necessarily correlate to my immediate geographic area. This is like coming as far as Hogback in terms of water table. There's huge springs.
Well, what the corridor consists of is it basically correlates the watershed size, which should account for groundwater and surface water interaction to determine how much water is in the channel at a certain point. And it relates, it's basically an equation that was developed from research done all over the world that relates the watershed size and the channel size to how much room the river needs. So, you know, in effect, it accounts for all of the water in the system. But we don't go out and measure groundwater flow. You know, we just base it on the watershed size and how wide the channel is, you know. So how wide the channel is should reflect all of the inputs to the system.
I'll just add one more thing on that. I mean, my personal observation is noticing unsaturated ground. I mean, that is where the erosion just happens immediately. So if it's spring seeping out of a bank and the river comes up, it just takes that saturated soil immediately away.
Mm-hmm.
My other problem was earthworms. I think it's due to I'm a favorite fishing spot. So it's not native earthworms, it's European redworms.
Oh, interesting.
And I have, you know, maybe 2 feet of worm castings, which we could sweep with a broom away. And so the river just took it, took it. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
I've read or heard somewhere that some of the stream gauges are probably going to be pulled because of the lack of funding.
I've heard that too. The USGS runs those gauges, and I've heard that they, I've seen maps of ones that I think all the ones in Vermont are sort of, I'm not sure that it's been determined that they're going to be eliminated, but they're at least talking about it.
That's
but,
what it said, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really bad time, just given that we just had this big flood to suddenly, I mean, that's, you know, a large...
Is there any other agency that could pick up the slack on that?
I don't know. I mean, I think I think somebody, the state would probably try to maintain those gauges at some point, but I don't know how much it costs. Like, I just don't know enough about it. But it's really, it is really important data that we need. So it would be a shame to see those.
Would the major problem, if they pull their funding, would it be on maintenance, or would it be on getting the readings, or what?
I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know enough about the gauge. I mean, I've just heard what you've heard through the news, that they've, that there's some of them are up for being discontinued. I don't know how much they cost or, what the funding issue is. I assume it's federal funding because it's the USGS. But yeah, we need that data.
My general impression, and I'm not an alarmist, is that if we really are looking at as much ice loss as we are having on the planet itself, and the levels of water are rising, that's going to change how much you say, could come down on us.
Mm-hmm.
And now's not the time to cut a way to measure this, but really to beef it up, perhaps.
Right. And it was really helpful during the flood to watch the gauges, for me anyway, it was really helpful to have those gauges available to watch and know, where we were with the flooding. And yeah. I mean, then we wouldn't have any way to know what kind of a flood we had if we don't have the gauges. I mean, I guess we could do, surveys after, the unofficial survey afterwards, which we do. We go out and do high water marks and, survey those and do things like that. But, yeah, they are really helpful to have.
Do we have 1 or 2 more comments, questions? The Conservation Commission is very much interested in this topic, and I've heard that the Planning Commission and the Select Board likewise are going to be dealing with it in the coming weeks and months. Do any of my colleagues here from those boards want to say something about that process? Don't all speak at once.
I have a comment, but it's
Sure.
not about that process. There was an assessment done on the Crosby roads.
Right. Yep.
And I don't know,
I worked.
several years ago, but I don't think there was any follow-up on that, but I'm not sure.
We've done some follow-up. Is Crosby Brook in Dummerston partially?
Yes, the 2
It is.
branches.
Okay. Yep, we did an assessment. We did a quarter plans. We developed projects, and we had a couple of public meetings about that. And we have done some follow-up. There's a couple of projects being implemented in the watershed, some lower down. There's one that's being worked on up above. I know the town is trying to do some stormwater improvements on some of the roads. Brattleboro is trying to do some stormwater improvements. So there has been some work on the Crosby. I'm not sure, I don't think any of it has occurred in Dummerston, but I'm not sure exactly where the line is. So, but I can look into it and let you know. If you're interested in seeing that report and you want to give me your email, I can send you a link.
I have a copy of the report from.
You do? Okay. Yeah,
There are two branches of that.
the Crosby.
Right.
Right.
One is on, sort of on Black Mountain, it comes down and feeds into, and then there's the headwaters are in Dummerston,
Mm-hmm.
and it flows down and connects, it flows down to Brattleboro and connects with the Black Mountain Road.
Right. I can't remember, it's been a number of years, I can't remember off the top of my head which ones. I know that the Black Mountain one was assessed. I can't remember if the other branch was.
I did see some
Assessed.
people working, actually down by your ways,
Both branches were assessed.
Yeah, so then they should be, I don't know if projects were identified. I know that we did have an outreach effort on Crosby Brook where we reached out to landowners that owned property on areas that we had identified as high priority. I'm not sure, I can't remember off the top of my head, like if any of those were in Dummerston, but
I think most of it was in Brattleboro.
yeah, maybe, that might be maybe where the problem areas are. I'm not sure.
Well, the town's in the process of updating its zoning bylaw, so it makes sense to take a look at the flood hazard regulations. Another part of the update is a look at wildlife habitat corridors, some of which in the town plan are along brooks, like Canoe Brook. And, these kinds of things tie in together, and it would be useful to, get some additional help to review the bylaw from this perspective.
Sure. Are you working with the Regional Planning Commission on your
Yeah,
zoning update?
Yeah, we are, and we should add that to the mix of things that we need help on.
Yeah, sure. I can work with them and get them, some information, or I can work with the town, whatever you need.
Well, Shannon, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.